What's up, everybody? I'm back with another video from the second story. I did one of her videos before and I thoroughly enjoyed it, so I wanted to check out another video of hers. This one called Modern Heroes Are Weak and Boring. So I'm curious to know what's her take. Follow her channel. Like to give credit where credit is due to any videos that I'm watching. Follow me on my YouTube channel, Twitch and YouTube, as I stream games, review review content, review and react to videos. But without further ado, let's check out what she has to say. And of course, I increase the speed of the video so it won't take up longer than it needs to be.
I don't know about you, but I see things like this all the time. I have also heard more times than I can count that heroes are boring, that villains are more interesting, and that anti-heroes are apparently where it's really at. These days, I'd probably have to partly agree. Heroes are boring. The thing is, though, heroes are not supposed to be boring. I grew up with a great love for a whole wide range of heroic characters. But there really is no getting around the fact that heroes have become very, very dull. But how is it that heroes became so dull? When did we start calling every character and their brother-in-law an anti-hero? Why is it so hard to define morality in characters? And why is everyone so obsessed with making villains into the good guys, and vice versa? We're going to save our discussion about villains for another day. We already have way too much ground to cover. For today, we're going to focus on heroes and, to a slightly lesser degree, anti-heroes. To start with, let's talk about heroes. Currently, a lot of written variations on heroic characters have one or more of these three primary problems. The writer assumes that the hero cannot have any significant flaws, especially moral flaws, nor can they have a different moral opinion or be morally inferior to themselves or any other good character in the story. Heroes are not permitted to develop in terms of moral character, but must begin and end with the same overall characteristic, especially morally. And heroes must necessarily represent the writer's moral opinion about the real world, regardless of what is occurring within the world of the story. In my search for a single definition of hero, Google told me this: a fictional hero is a character in a story who possesses extraordinary qualities and abilities, and who is typically admired for their courage, strength, or noble deeds. Weirdly specific and weirdly vague at the same time. These are the types of phrases you'll see a lot when you try to define hero characters. Conventional heroism, noble qualities, strength, strong moral compass, etc., etc. The internet in general is hesitant to define hero. I can't decide if that's because they don't know or because they instinctively realize that it's unhelpful to be so randomly restrictive. Most of the lectures I have seen or the essays I have read on this topic treat characters as if they all necessarily must fit into some category or other. Appears who doesn't seem to fit into any of these categories, they just invent new categories. It's a completely nonsensical way to approach characters. According to the dictionary, volume 5 of the 1933 Oxford English Dictionary to be exact, there are 5 definitions for the word hero, all very similar. I'll put the first 3 on the screen so you can read them, but
There you go. Let me just read the first 3. A name given, as in Homer, to men of superhuman strength, courage, or ability favored by the gods, at a later time regarded as intermediate between gods and men and immortal. Number 2, a man distinguished by extraordinary valor and martial achievements, one who does brave or noble deeds, an illustrious warrior. Number 3, a man who exhibits extraordinary bravery, firmness, fortitude, or greatness of soul in any course of action or in connection with any pursuit, work, or enterprise. A man admired and venerated for his achievements and noble qualities.
I want you to pay special attention to the 4th definition. The man who forms the subject of an epic, the chief male personage in a poem, play, or story, he in whom the interest of the story or plot is centered. Originally, and indeed in most academic settings, a hero is little more than the male main character of a story, with, of course, a heroine being a female main character. What's important to note here is that historically, on average, the majority of writers did not need to be told what specific traits they ought to give their heroic characters in order for readers to perceive them as heroic. Many characters from older works possess a whole array of traits, some good, some bad. Typically speaking, once measured in full, you do tend to see more of a good person than a bad person, But now we're getting into tricky territory. There are some writing resources that will say basically the same thing I just said, that heroes can still have flaws, can still be selfish, weak, etc., can still be just regular people trying to get by.
Hold on a second. I'm just... Alright, just double checking. Usually people pop up randomly when I'm reacting to videos.
But even when a modern-day writer is equipped with that knowledge, the idea of taking a regular person, a normal character, and crafting that person together with all their flaws into someone with a moral compass pointed solidly at good, in these days apparently is very, very hard. Why? Like it or not, the fictional representation of heroism, virtue, and morality in media is necessarily reliant on the writer's understanding of heroism, virtue, and morality. In these days, very few people, never mind writers, really understand these things. And even if they do, even if most writers could, to some degree, be considered moral individuals, that doesn't mean that they will understand the immense moral complexities that they attempt to write for their characters. So it follows that the characters will inevitably have less and less moral realism, resulting in less and less compelling or interesting heroes. If a writer doesn't understand true morality, how can the morality of their characters be interesting, complex, or in any way true to real life? Basically, in order to write morality in characters, especially complex morality, you have to understand morality yourself. I mean, really understand it, not just have some vague, undefined opinion on the matter. And this is a line of thought that is simply no longer explored in our society. It's no wonder all characters are moral mush, and heroes especially are enormously boring. So,
yeah, because certain people in these writers' rooms can barely tell you what's a woman. And, if they can barely tell you that on a basic fundamental level, then they, of course they can't give you like a good solid definition on like morality, because it's always supposed to be some kind of ambiguous thing, because they want to mold it in a way that suits their own personal lifestyle. Otherwise they'll probably feel like it's some kind of personal attack, like they're inherently immoral because it doesn't align with the exact definition or something or other. So they'll just play around with it. That's why when you see it onto the screen or onto the pages, it's always so, like she said, mushy. That's why certain people shouldn't be writers.
What to do. Most writers, and even a lot of people these days, don't really even realize that morality is an area of study or something that you can learn about. Most writers don't realize that morality needs to be considered when constructing heroes or any character. Yet, it's impossible to really define heroism without talking about morality. Even if writers and teachers do understand that such a thing is essential to the study of heroes and heroic characters.
Look at something like The Acolyte. You can't tell me like Leslie Headland understood anything about morality. It's just her little personal therapy session, some hang up she has over her father. And it's just like having like, trying to make like the Sith the good guys and the Jedi inherently evil, or just so corrupt. And it's like, didn't she say in an interview one time, it's like, she always identified with the Sith or something like that. It's just vastly different from how George Lucas specifically defined, and he understood, specifically defined between good guys and the bad guys, between the light side and the dark side. You can look it up as he's like making this in like one of the writers of my thing, and he's defining and breaking it down in terms of what the Jedi are and what the Sith are. It's very poignant. It chokes you up the way he pointed it out. It's just like, like I don't want to sit there and try to do it verbatim. You got to look it up yourself, so that way you can get it from the horse's mouth. But that is clearly defined. And that's why his stuff is so like brings it from okay to perfect. But that's also in thanks to his ex-wife, who also helped him with some of the stuff. So, but as soon as he stepped away and Disney took over, little by little they get these certain writers in, and they or even somebody like Leslie, not just Leslie Headland, but like somebody like Kathleen Kennedy, who don't understand. And she's supposed to learn something from George Lucas. Clearly not. She was just ready to like just take over and just bastardize it all, little by little. Again, people in here who don't understand like the hero's journey, the formula, and can't even understand basic heroism and morality. And you get them in these rooms, and of course, why you think things like Star Wars or Star Trek are just slop.
Characters, most are hesitant to venture into moral territory. What if someone disagrees with you? What if you get canceled on the internet? There is definitely an aspect of fear at play. A lot of writers are afraid. So instead, when they're trying to build, are hesitant to venture into moral territory. What if someone disagrees with you? What if you
Bogus social media outrage is making authors change lines in their books now. The silly idea that a fictional character's statements reflect an author's actual beliefs is spreading. Yeah, because most of them don't understand, these little snowflakes out there who can't parse between what's within the context of a story and how the writer might actually think. You don't even know. If they do believe the exact same thing, what's that is not really like affecting you. You don't have to read the material. But forcing authors to having to rework, that's why, like, some of the literature, I think Hillary here pointed out, I think in the last video I did of hers, it's been super feminized, where everything has to, tiptoe around certain words to avoid hurting somebody's fifis. Instead of just like allowing freedom of speech, which books fall under.
get canceled on the internet? There is
Young adult author cancels own novel after race controversy. Advanced copies of Amelia Wen Zhao's Blood Hair were criticized for his depiction of slavery, for which the author apologized and pulled publication. Shouldn't have to apologize. This lady should have stood on business. She had every right to write whatever she so choose to. You're supposed to be able to have that level of freedom. Now, of course, nobody has to read it. Or if you do read it and it doesn't suit your own purview, don't ever read it again. It's like Huckleberry Finn had the N-word in it. Okay, I've read it. It's a book. And yeah, it's like he's telling a story of a particular time period that would have been freely using that word all live long day. Obviously, the author won't be like just spouting out N-word here and there in their personal lives. This is where like the whole wokeism gone too far. This is why people mock it, because even somebody like writers who can't freely express what they want to write about, well, them having to be forced to pull their book or change words because somebody else couldn't take it upon themselves to not pick it up, or just don't read it, just move on with their lives.
definitely an aspect of fear at play. A lot of writers are afraid. So instead, when they're trying to build characters, especially heroes and anti-heroes, writers will instead focus mainly on those formulaic set of requirements that you find all over the internet, that everyone more or less agrees on, kind of, I guess. These categories seem to list traits and qualities that each of these character classes must possess, like saying only a car with 4 doors can be considered a sedan, and so on.
If you handpick or restrain creativity from writers or directors or whomever in the creative space, then the material suffers. Creativity will suffer in general, and that's why people are worrying about AI right now, because they're just gonna mimic what's been slopped out in the past several years at this point, because nobody's fully expressing themselves. Nobody's putting them personhood into their material. There's no humanity in it, because part of humanity is being messy. Taking the extra mile, whether it's with a joke or with certain stories. It's like going beyond, bringing humanity to that edge. It's just, but it's like, you said a word, I can't handle it. You change it instead of me not listening. Like, let me force reality to change into like how I want it to be. Creativity is suffering, all because certain people have to listen to those small, minute people who didn't learn how to handle life when they were children. Now the general public got to deal with it. That's on the site for the scary movie coming out in June that I just reacted to the trailer of. Just, I want everybody to start getting hurt. I want them to feeling like a bit of pressure, get over themselves, and learn this is the kind of stuff we used to grow up with. We used to understand that life, as Batman put it, life doesn't give you seatbelts.
Which is, I guess, great if you're trying to classify cars, but in my experience, humans are not so easily defined. And so why should our characters be? Writers who find themselves unable or unwilling to navigate the complex moral landscape in which they've placed their heroes will find that it is difficult to understand, and therefore to write, how a hero who does some bad things or who has serious flaws is still a hero. This can't be reconciled with the more commonly popular and excessively simplistic understanding of morality today. The resulting hero will then be an incredibly boring cardboard cutout who does little more than parrot the popular moral and ethical hot words of current year, while otherwise expressing very little of any moral opinion of any kind. This is boring, everyone knows it. Therefore, the more attractive and easier solution is to skip morality and simply make an anti-hero. Yet somehow even the anti-heroes are also boring. How is this happening? So what is an anti-hero? This is the only non-internet definition of anti-hero I could find. This is Bennett's Reader's Encyclopedia from 1996. Their definition of anti-hero is a protagonist who lacks tradition.
If you need to look up the definition of certain things, try to avoid internet definition of certain things, because it often changes depending on the current state of things, and it's usually like not given like the the exact origin of the actual word, not the 2020 something of the definition.
Traditional heroic virtues and noble qualities, and is sometimes inept, cowardly, stupid, or dishonest, yet sensitive. This definition honestly makes me so mad that if my version of this book wasn't digital, I'd probably be flinging it out of the window right now. First of all, the same book offers no definition of hero, if you can believe it, and obviously never elaborates on these traditional heroic virtues and noble qualities. This second part here that talks about anti-heroes being inept, etc., is arbitrary in the extreme. I can think of a dozen characters deemed heroes in the traditional sense who possess some or all of these qualities, if only at some point in their development. But this last part here is probably the root of all our problems. According to the folks who cobbled together this definition, an anti-hero is, despite all his flaws, sensitive. I know I'm not the only person to have noticed this, but in today's world, the only metric by which morality seems to be able to be measured is one of feelings. These days, the only means by which people learn to understand what morality is by determining whether or not the thing makes them feel good. Never mind that feelings are inherently subjective. If something makes them feel bad, it must be immoral. If something makes them feel good, it must be morally acceptable, no matter what it is. Morality, in reality, has very little, if anything, to do with a person's feelings. If a person fails to learn the absolutes of morality, they will never be able to convey its nuances. This idea that an anti-hero is blah 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 noble traits and yada 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 conventional heroism, but must above all be sensitive, is referring specifically to this. In some way, this anti-hero either must himself be sensitive to the plight and therefore the feelings of others, or more often must himself tug at the sensitive feelings of the audience. Reducing morality to a matter strictly of emotion is how you get these incredibly disturbing occurrences, like audiences growing sympathetic enough towards the likes of Jeffrey Dahmer that they find him to be not responsible for his crimes, or even find his crimes to be not so bad or even justifiable. The writers themselves, despite their claims to the contrary,
And that's why we get these stupid like Disney remakes trying to sympathize with the villain is too much. And a lot of people has started to notice that and complain about it because sometimes villains just need to be villains. We don't want to sympathize with Scar or Maleficent. Or, it's like, no, they had no qualms of doing what they did. Sometimes people are just born an a-hole. It's just like, yeah, they need to like start taking out feelings and out of every little thing. I'm glad she put it, articulated in that perfect way. Morality does not care about feelings because they are so fleeting. It's just sometimes things are just black and white. You throw your brother off a cliff into a herd of antelope. Evil. I don't care, like, you was looked over as a child and he was favored. All that is just neutralized at that point.
Seem to be perhaps unintentionally leaning in this direction, tugging at the natural tendency of audiences to feel empathy for characters who are suffering, guiding the moral interpretation of their tale in such a way to stir up feelings of uncomfortable sympathy for its real-life titular serial killer, as a kind of shortcut to compelling writing. This is a closely related problem. Most writers these days falsely equate these feelings of discomfort with actual good writing. If they've made their audience feel uncomfortable, then they've succeeded in writing a compelling character, or so they assume. When the reality was that Netflix's Dahmer character was uncomfortable because the writer's assessment and presentation of morality was so upside down. On top of that, audiences could only assess Dahmer's morality based on feelings. So if he made them feel sorry for him, that must mean he's not bad. This kind of childish approach to morality is the most common today. Finding themselves compelled to feel sympathy for a sadistic serial killer made viewers uncomfortable. Not because it was compelling, but because it was an affront to basic morality. It's the same mechanic as the one at play when we feel uncomfortable watching a sexual assault scene. It's not because it's compelling or well written or realistic or anything else. It's because it's violently assaulting our understanding of morality.
Yeah, when she phrased it like that, I can't help but think about as much as I like the show, uh, um, Andor season 2. I think a lot of people can argue it was completely unnecessary to put that grape scene into the show. Was it in the second season? Pretty sure it was the second season. It was completely unnecessary just for shock value to show you like how horrendous the Empire is. I think people who grew up on Star Wars pretty sure they got the idea that the Empire are bad people. It's like we see multitude of examples prior to Andor. We got it. You putting this in is just more so on shock value than anything else, and it's just like it was so unnecessary. I don't care how some people are like, oh, it's so raw, so real, and it's like, and then some certain shills, like, let's be real, like want to like challenge you is like, oh, like you don't understand Star Wars. It's like, oh, the Empire have done some horrific stuff, and it's just like it's it's just unnecessary. Okay, you can't like make that okay to put in something that is supposed to be Star Wars in general is supposed to be for kids. Sure, this particular show is meant for a slightly older audience, but let's be real. Disney, a kids brand, a family brand, has bought Star Wars Lucasfilm to merge together, and most of the Star Wars projects, young kids watch it. So you putting that stuff in was like it definitely a shock to the system. Yeah, it was a shock, but not like a pleasant one. It's just certain things that's like, as she puts it, it's just like you don't understand like the whole basis of like morality, and your worldview has like you interjected it into this material that it just seems out of the blue.
However, many are only able to assess the morality at play in a scene of sexual assault based on the feelings it evokes. Because it upsets them or makes them feel sad, that's how they are able to determine that the act depicted must be immoral. When scenes of this nature are written in such a way to attempt to downgrade those feelings of revolt,
you know the Empire is immoral. This is like you putting that particular scene in. It was just like it's like what you think after multitude of decades at this point, you think certain people just don't get it yet that the Empire is bad? Like, oh, geez, I didn't understand the Empire was like this even until we put this, R word scene into it. Oh, now I get it. Oh my God, I'm like, I was on the side of the Empire until this moment. Oh my God, it's like who did not get that? Why this scene needs to be like brought in?
or discomfort, some audiences will call this compelling and will be less able to assess the morality because they don't find themselves feeling particularly bad, given the deliberate writing. Audiences, and as it happens, writers who have not properly or adequately trained themselves in their understanding of morality will interpret these feelings of sympathy for Dahmer or an assault victim as moral judgment. I feel sorry for him, therefore he must not be morally bad, which is a big reason why writers often use this method to make characters more sympathetic. They make the character a victim of something, thereby causing the audience to feel sorry for them, and thus soften their moral judgment. All of this because all parties involved, writers and audiences, are wrongly using emotions to judge morality. In order to build from scratch a morally complex or at least interesting character, and also in order for the writer to know whether that character is a hero, an anti-hero, or a villain, the writer has to have some very firm, very basic understanding of objective, non-emotionally driven morality. The more complex the story's moral landscape, the more complex the writer's understanding must be. This is why so many of the big, masterful writers spend so long studying morality and philosophy and struggling to wrap their ordinary person minds around extraordinary moral circumstances. It's hard work. They don't always get it right, but it results in genuinely compelling literature. And most people, and most writers these days, simply do not have that breadth of understanding. You can absolutely gain that kind of knowledge, but as I said, it's hard work. Most people don't even realize that morality is not an emotional matter. Writers seem to find no real benefit in exploring morality in any sense other than how it makes them feel and how they can use it to affect the emotions of their readers. But I mean, think about it. If the only thing that the writer has used to build the morality of the written world and the characters is how it makes him or her feel, the chances that such morality will resonate with another person are 10,000 to 1. You'd have to find a reader who feels the same way about all these things as you do, and then you'd have to hope that your feelings while writing adequately portray the morals, and that the reader's feelings while reading happen to be just in sync enough to receive that portrayal as you intended. Everyone else will read and not have a single clue what kind of morality you've got going on there, or about the morality of the characters, heroes, anti-heroes, or villains, and will probably be bored or underwhelmed with the characters, or they'll feel very differently about them, leading them to interpret your heroic characters as monsters and your monsters as compelling anti-heroes. This isn't just poor writing, it results in an ongoing proliferation of very poor understanding of morality in general, and there's plenty of science out there to support the idea that human beings form a lot of their moral opinions by ingesting fiction, especially at younger ages. And I'm not saying that all character science out there to support
how empathy with fictional characters undermines moral self-trust.
The idea that human beings
the effects of reading and watching fiction on the development of social cognition, a systematic review. Social cognition is an umbrella term used to address the set of neurocognitive processes involved in effective social interactions such as theory of mind and empathy, and is important for understanding of others' intentions and actions and decision making. Narratives can serve as tools for learning social norms and understanding other people as they involve mental simulations of social interactions. This review aimed to gather the results of current studies on the effects of reading and watching fiction, movies.
Form a lot of their moral opinions by ingesting
the psychology of fiction, why reading transform is emotional.
Fiction, especially at younger ages. And I'm not saying that all characters have to be beacons of morality. The trick there is for the flaws to be written as flaws within the moral landscape of the story. A character can be the most morally complex guy on the planet, but the writing needs to also acknowledge this fact, which means that the writer needs to understand the moral clay with which the morally complex guy has been formed. And that clay does not include emotions. I love heroes with flaws. I love tragic heroes who become villains. Like most people, I find such characters wonderfully fascinating. Not because I find the flaws themselves fascinating, and in truth, I believe that's not what it is about flawed characters that draws us to them. It's the potential for growth that delights me. Nothing thrills me more than a character who either takes responsibility for his flaws and then makes himself better, or conversely, a character who is overcome by his flaws and becomes a tragic character.
Yeah. When she put that, I can't help but think about Tony Stark, Iron Man, compared to something like Riri Williams' Ironheart. Because both have flaws, but only one seems to have overcome those, made it like a compelling character. Tony Stark, is definitely egotistical. He is an alcoholic, and he tried to put like a suit of armor behind around the world in order to try to protect everyone. He's like, he tends to be obsessive. He pushed the Avengers into breaking apart, but he ended up overcoming that by pulling together the team and made the ultimate sacrifice by bringing everybody back and stopping Thanos. Good round, a guy who tries to do everything, who wouldn't lay down his life for other people. The same guy who said he'll just cut the wire and try to figure a way out of it is the same guy who's now the guy who made the ultimate play for everybody else and let his buddies, how Steve put it, like, walk over him or something like that. Compared to Riri Williams, who worked with criminals, who uses their intelligence to make, I won't say make money, but it's like selling like certain tech to help people, like, with their grades or something like that. It was against the rules, working with criminals, and then like and then not telling her, her friend that she made like an AI version of his sister, working with the like making a deal with the literal devil. It's like completely, no pun intended, stark difference. And it's just like you can tell what kind of writers you had on one end and what kind of writers you had on the other end. One understood morality and character growth and understand like flaws and how to overcome them, while you let the other get consumed by them and still call it heroic.
However, no matter how flawed or not flawed or how...
But you can't call that out because they'll be racist. You can't like point that out.
well written such a character is, everything about that character will fall flat if the foundational morality on which he is built is itself either unstable and uncertain or wholly erroneous. That is to say, if a writer doesn't understand basic morality, then how can they even begin to write morally complex characters?
I have a question.
You can ask me anything.
Most often, if a writer doesn't wish to bother with such things, they'll make their characters as amoral as they can. While amoral characters can be interesting, attempting to insert such a character into a world which itself also has no clear morality, the complexity that results will actually be terribly simplistic. The only real foundational baseline in such a story is that anything goes. Everyone's mostly bad at heart, and it only really matters in terms of how it makes us feel. Books and films and shows like this often use shocking or revolting plot events to manipulate the emotions of the audience into thinking that they're looking at a matter of compelling moral ambiguity. As I said before, more and more, evoking discomfort in the audience has been conflated with good writing for exactly this reason. It's pretty easy to manipulate the audience's emotions, especially if that audience is not inclined to look any deeper than emotion. Some less skilled or less experienced writers will attempt to build a heroic character into one who is morally ambiguous, but again, doing so only in this way. Which traits can I give this guy that make me personally personally feel bad. Those are the ones I'll give him, and then he'll be morally ambiguous. Whether or not he actually is morally ambiguous is a roll of the dice. It depends on how the writer felt about various things, how they felt that day, what mood they were in, and so forth. The odds that actually morally ambiguous things will make the writer feel bad are about 50-50, I'd say. But even then, most of these writers have never bothered to sit down and understand why, objectively, those bad traits are bad beyond the fact that they make them feel bad. So if they try to explain within the world of the story why these various traits and behaviors make this character morally ambiguous, there's simply no logic to it beyond the fact that it has some kind of negative emotional impact on the other characters, and also obviously the reader. This also leads you to those really contradictory characters. Men who have no problem keeping a woman captive, but then when they go to war, they absolutely refuse to do anything as inhumane as taking prisoners, and instead let them all go. And I don't mean this in terms of organically conflicted or hypocritical characters. This is rather a clear indicator that the writer is using nothing more than emotions to build morality. I mean, it all depends on how the given event makes the writer feel emotionally. If they feel too bad about taking war prisoners, they'll deem that a moral line the character can't cross, perhaps. If they feel, good-ish about the guy taking a lady he likes captive, well, that's a nice moral gray area to them. It all just depends on how everybody feels, I guess. Here's the thing. If you understand basic morality, or especially complex morality, you could actually write a heroic character who is deeply flawed without being morally ambiguous. We spent a decent amount of time speaking generalities, so I think now is a good time to...
I can't help but think about the kind of characters you will find in, like, Game of Thrones. A lot of them are very compelling characters. A lot of them are deeply flawed one way or the other, but it's still clearly defined villains and heroes. Like, what was Peter Dinklage's character's name? I forgot. He's definitely morally complex, but he's nowhere near, just like his father's, deeply complex, and his brother and sister are deeply complex, where you can still clearly see, like, their moral, the focal point that each of them have. One is like pointing due north. Jamie is like kind of north wavy here and there depending on the situation, while the sister and the father is morality is just like darn near in the pits. But it's just but the writer, typically, like it was George R.R. Martin, one of the best writers, understood, okay, complex characters, but he's still an a-hole. There are certain things he probably liked about Jamie Lannister's father, but full well at the end of the day, he's the kind of scumbag you did not care if you was actually hopeful that he gets taken down. But it was so much more satisfying. It was by the son he treated horribly. And it felt justified in a way. That is how you do it. You can make complex villains, but don't miss the plot by the fact that they're still villains. Don't try to make us sympathetic of certain people that are just like morally bankrupt at the end of the day. That's why we have the term morally bankrupt.
Whip out some examples. Given the state of modern media, if we want to find a genuinely heroic character written well who also has significant flaws, we'll have to go pretty far back in time to 2000's The Patriot and have a close look at one Benjamin Martin. And
I reviewed this last year around July. Very good film.
Important thing to remember when you're looking at this character. There's a big difference between characters who are morally ambiguous and characters who have flaws. Mel Gibson's wonderful Benjamin Martin is a very, very heroic character. Let me rephrase that. He's an extremely morally upright character. He has built his character and his life around doing the right thing in every situation. The right thing isn't always obvious, but he's always trying to find it. He's always trying to be a good man and a good father, but he has one very, very big flaw. His temper. It's shown early with the rocking chair incident and hinted at with his past acts of furious violence during other military conflicts. He understands these past acts not as injustices in themselves, as they had been carried out as a necessary response to a brutal massacre, but as instances in which he lost his temper and therefore his head acting on emotion instead of with reason, resulting in behavior that would be more in keeping with an animal than a thinking man. Interestingly, with Benjamin Martin, his efforts to combat that flaw by maintaining a firmly neutral stance in the building Revolutionary War created a kind of secondary flaw that was somewhat similar to cowardice. Obviously, it wasn't cowardice, it was actually far more complex, but it nevertheless led directly to the shocking murder of his young son by a sadistic redcoat. His fear of his flaw led him to overcorrect with inaction. Even when war was at his doorstep, he attempted to reason calmly with the man preparing to destroy his home and hang his son as a spy. His attempts to avoid the fury of his own temper meant that he was weakened to the point that he was easy picking for a villain looking to make an example of him. It was only after the damage had been done and he saw the result of his mistake that he loaded his guns and literally went to war. Doing so, by the way, was not depicted as wrong. In fact, this moral point is brought home very poetically when Martin's sister-in-law tells him, after he massacred the men who destroyed his home, "You've done nothing for which you should be ashamed." To which he replied, "I've done nothing, for that I am ashamed."
Tonight, in your spacious La Quinta suite.
Man, that scene was so good. You know, say what you will about like Mel Gibson, he's an incredible actor, man. Like his stuff is like just darn good, you know, work.
My movie writing used to be good. Because of the true moral complexity of this exceptionally drawn character, he could remain entirely heroic despite the constant inner battle he was fighting against his ferocious temper.
Yeah, check out my review of The Patriot on my YouTube channel, because like I go very in depth because I had so much to say about that film in terms of like more so like with the patriotism and what it like meant to be an American, and especially fighting around this particular time and how crucial it was, all that stuff. Like, definitely check it out, because I remember I had a lot to say about it.
True moral questions could be asked which were very hard to answer. If his terrible temper turned him into a monster, were his monstrous actions justified if carried out for the right reason? If he refused to fight in order to avoid his temper, were his inactions actually cowardice? Did inaction do more harm? It sounds simple, but this solid moral ground creates deep complexity without moral ambiguity. A point worth noting. On one occasion, when Colonel Tavington antagonized him about his dead son, Benjamin Martin very calmly vowed to kill him before the war was done. In the end, he did just that. There was no hint of gray in this act. Avenging his murdered children was a natural and right thing for him to do, morally speaking. The trick for him was to do so calmly, without being controlled by the emotional rage of his temper. He had failed when fear had led him to inaction, resulting in the death of one of his sons. He had failed again in the opening fight when he had brutally taken his hatchet to that redcoat while trying to save his other son. He had failed again when he shot men who had been surrendering. For Martin, the climactic final development of his character was whether or not he could fulfill his duty as a patriot and as a father without becoming a slave to his emotions. What's important to see here is that the writer of Benjamin Martin...
And this is how men learn about stoicism. Because, you know, it's not like... Because some people, you know, misconstrue stoicism. Usually, like, you know, feminists like argue like men need to be more vulnerable and express themselves. No, guys are a lot more mostly controlled, because we know how dangerous it can be if we fly off the handle, because we are typically stronger. Guys who don't control his emotions, not saying he doesn't have them, they misconstrues being stoic mean no emotions at all. No, he has emotions. He knows how to aim it or curve it or control it. Guys who fly off the handle, you know, it's not good for society. Guys who become a blubbering mess, it's not good for society. It's like, you're a man, you gotta behave like one. You are a part of a collective of guys who have, like, you gotta be out there, got a job to do, you got things to carry on. You have to be the, you know, emotionally, like, you know, stern. Not saying you can't have feelings, but that's what you got your brethren for. You got like a father or trusted comrades to pour your emotions out to, because they will, like, you know, dust you off and point you where you need to be, give you the right advice that you need to hear, not want to hear, but you need to hear, so you can collect yourself and maintain focus. Things happen in the world. I made a TikTok, you can follow me on my TikTok. I made a TikTok video about the origins of Stoicism, and you know how, like, the philosophers of old mentions that life is going to life. It's how you, like, you know, things going to happen that's more so out of your control. You have to maintain course and keep yourself in control. You can't wig out for things that, 9 times out of 10 you cannot, rein in. That's why young boys need to look up to characters like Benjamin in The Patriot, where he learns emotional control. That's his arc. You look at someone like Batman, is like an epitome of indomitable will and strength and stoicism, controlling the emotions, but he has people he can confide into. But as soon as he steps out of the Batcave or outside the Wayne Mansion, he is a rock. That's what, especially young women, needs to have men like that who are emotional rocks. Not like robots, just emotional, pillars. Steady, stern. Keep things upright. But there are certain people who want to make you seem like that is a bad thing, or you're not emotionally healed, or it's not emotionally intelligent. No, that is, people who are stoic are the most emotionally intelligent above anybody else, who just lean with their emotions willy-nilly. And it's usually women, which is fine because that's what is expected of them. It's not expected of guys. Guys need to have some level of control, because without it, it doesn't benefit society. All right, 1 second. Be right back. I gotta take care of something really quick. All right, there we go.
And had a firm grasp on the objective morality of the world in which Martin was placed, and also on morality in the real world, that of the audience who would watch the film. As such, this character could be portrayed with crisp, glowing heroism and deep, uncomfortable flaws. He was real, but he was admirable. If anything, his flaws and his constant struggle to overcome them made him even more admirable. None of this would have been possible had the character or the world been written with an emotionally based, uncertain, subjective morality. If Martin's various character flaws had been judged based solely on how they made their characters or the audience feel, then the actual morality of the character himself would have been very vague and wishy-washy. The writer had clearly made an effort to understand the objective morality at play in the life of an 18th century colonial soldier. The world itself was painted with moral absolutes.
If the picture was made today, it'll be filled with a bunch of modern day terminology or feminism, or things that in the backdrop of the period piece that you're trying to depict would not make sense. Like, you have a bunch of females trying to be boss chicks, or try to step in and just saying things or doing things that wouldn't make sense in the time period it's in. They'll be like trying to insert there were black people in the film that, or at least a couple of them. I know one in particular, but they'll be going ham with political messaging or identity politics in a colonial period. If the picture was made today, it wouldn't be like, historically accurate, or at least closely as accurate as possible. It would be nonsensical. It's like, women wouldn't be behaving like the women of that era. So therefore it wouldn't have matched. But then you'll get certain shows on it's like, oh, they're just being a bigot because, oh my God, you can have no women in no colonial period. I'm pretty sure there was like women in, fighting in the war too. And it's like, and they'll do like so much deep dive trying to dig as much as they can find. One singular woman, Tabitha Smith of 17 something, and like she wielded a flintlock pistol and shot a redcoat one time, and it's like that justifies it. But that's just but that's not the majority. What is expected? What is obvious? What is like the historical norm? It's just like nerve wracking, It's like you can't just like, I'm pretty sure there's like historian consultants on certain films, but you gotta maintain like some legitimacy to the backdrop that you're trying to depict in your film. It's just like certain. It's like you're looking at Gladiator 2. Like most of that stuff, I guarantee you, because I think like even Russell Crowe even brought up, by comparison to the first one and the second one is night and day, because the first one is like a lot more faithful to the historical backdrop by comparison to something like Gladiator 2. When the main character clearly was like, God, I seen clips. I didn't bother to even watch the doggone thing. Whereas, like you got these, soldiers or gladiators, I wouldn't say they were emotional. I wouldn't go that far, but it's just like a stark contrast to how like, warriors of the first film were behaving. It just seems like. It's not the worst thing. There's been other worse examples, but I'm just saying, it's just like, by comparison, the Patriot is like, is like, walks the same line as the first Gladiator film in terms of, flawed main character, but it's still stoic and like, a stoic warrior hero, knowing, right from wrong and stuff. Like, you obviously ain't getting that from Gladiator 2.
Thus, the heroism of Benjamin Martin
or even something like 300. Like, Leonidas is like, just like with Benjamin, just like with what's Russell Crowe's character's name? It's on the tip of my tongue in Gladiator. Maximus. It falls right in that line of stoic, brave heroes that know clearly right from wrong and will do everything they can to stop the clear villain. And women, I want to say know their place, but there's women of those eras behaving like the women of those eras. Not saying they're damsels, but they have a particular role. Like Leonidas' wife had a particular role, and she did it very well in terms of the politics of it all. He's trying to get like Leonidas the backup that he needed in order to deal with the Persians. And he even looks at her because he knows what he was about to do and know what fallout it will lead. But getting that nod from her, that confirmation, like, no, he's been this messenger, and the people he worked for have been utterly disrespectful. Not only that, they've been turning people into slaves. This is not going to stand here, not in Sparta, not anywhere else. And he does that epic kick and that line, "This is Sparta!" It kicks him into that hole. she didn't need to pick up a spear and a shield in order to fight with the men, because it wouldn't make any sense, because there's no female Spartans ever. So, like, if like the picture is made today, I guarantee you there'll be some writers or people trying to make sure it gets nominated for the Academy Award. They gotta fill some kind of quota. So it's like, okay, we need to put like a woman, wearing, wielding some flintlock pistols and fighting some redcoats. Otherwise, we wouldn't get nominated for this and that and the third, like the first one did. It's all messed up. That's why we need to get rid of these DEI programs, because you don't have organic hiring practices. There's no organic writers that's willing to spitball and not afraid to probably push certain lines in order to get like some proper storytelling.
Able to shine on its own power. Let's look at another flawed hero. This one, however, is these days often...
Hold up. I didn't see if it's like anybody voicing their little... Okay, let's make sure. Sometimes people pop up here and there.
Labeled an anti-hero, which is so baffling that I almost find it insulting. This time we're going even farther back, all the way to 1972's Rambo First Blood. John Rambo is objectively heroic in many respects. He's a military veteran who managed to find a way to fight as honorably as he could within a very ugly, ugly war. He was drafted, used by his government, abandoned, vilified, and left with nothing. But he remained calm, kind even, level-headed, respectful. When he was trying to find one of his former squad mates, he was incredibly polite when he was asking around, and extremely delicate and respectful when talking to the man's surviving family members. By all appearances, John Rambo was a very good man who just wanted to try to live what was left of his life. But he was waylaid by the pronounced belligerence of some scumbag sheriff. Even then, he didn't respond with hostility. It wasn't until they actually did violence that he responded with violence. As he said again and again, they drew first blood. His flaw was even more complex than Benjamin Martin's. It couldn't even be described as something as straightforward as PTSD, however straightforward that could be. Rambo had been conditioned with a certain firm moral code, which was to protect the innocent and obey his superiors and not to engage unless attacked. After the insanely cruel treatment by the sheriff and his deputies, he merely wanted to escape. He didn't want to kill anybody, he didn't want revenge, he just wanted to not be there anymore. Thereafter, they came for him, and he responded in kind. His military training and his battlefield instincts kicked in, then, together with a sliver of PTSD, as far as he was concerned, enemy agents were acting upon him, and his training dictated that he had to survive by any means necessary. And let's be honest, he wasn't, completely wrong. Despite this hard programming, he still made a point of avoiding killing people. There was nothing villainous about his behavior. There was nothing anti-moral. He was, for the most part, a regular guy, military background and trauma aside. He wasn't a hero in the comic book sense, but he was not a bad person whose motivations were selfish or even amoral. He was literally just some guy trying to survive, a good guy even. And in future additions to the franchise, he wasn't even using his skills and training for himself, but for others. In many ways, Rambo eventually became a pure hero in the comic book sense, especially in the fourth film, which is probably my personal second favorite in the franchise. From an analytical sense, John Rambo is incomprehensible unless you completely understand his moral code, as analyzed without emotion. Based on his training and his conditioning and the fact that intense war trauma had colored his mind, in that small mountain town, he found himself locked in a fight-or-die struggle for actual survival. Within that struggle, he behaved according to the moral code that was so deeply ingrained in his person. Perhaps for a regular person it would be somewhat unthinkable to engage in armed guerrilla combat in such a situation, but John Rambo's mind was battle-conditioned, while he himself still had strong moral fiber, which was not, let's face it, much different from any other person's. Almost everyone would agree that it is morally acceptable to defend oneself in a situation like that. There's nothing gray there. So taking that objective moral truth, the writers could allow Rambo's self-defense behavior to escalate just enough to allow the audience to wonder if there might have been a point in there where he might have crossed the line.
It's kind of wild that he was put in a Mortal Kombat game, though. I thought it was pretty dope.
A huge part of the success of that latter point is that the writers didn't spell it out. Leaving it open like that allowed the audience to think about it. And so what looked like a simple action movie instead became one of the most compelling depictions of post-Vietnam America ever put to film. Compelling not because it makes us uncomfortable or screws around with our surface emotions, but because it makes us think. An infinitely more useful sensation in any event. If John Rambo had been written solely from the standpoint of how...
And just like with any good comedy, it has to make you think. Movies need to, like the Terminator films, at least the first two, it made you think about fate is what you make. It's like, what is a machine, and like looking at something like how Sarah Connor turned out, where she was a simple waitress but got thrown into the mix of this potential war between humans and machines, and she ended up was about to kill Miles Dyson, and if it wasn't for her son reminding her of her humanity, she would end up turning to the very thing that she hated the most, which was a machine, cold, unfeeling robot. Her world got turned upside down. That is so compelling. There's a lot to mine from that, from those first two films. But in the most last few of the films, obviously it was clearly more feelings based than thinking based. That's why it's aside from just poor writing, well, yeah, the poor writing with the morality thing has to match up. As Hillary is putting it, it's like the writers don't understand morality, is all muddied up. So why is it the last few Terminator films got like the morality all turned upside down, and not in a good way? It's just like you don't understand because you're too busy thinking about everything else but the story, and try to make it layered and complex. It turned from like an action horror film genre into just action slop.
His morals made the writer feel, then we would have ended up with a very boring character whose behavior was dictated by the subjective emotions of the writers. The writing of First Blood also brings us to another element of the writing of compelling but morally interesting heroes. In order for the reader or audience to immerse themselves in the moral world of the story and find in it compelling food for thought, that entire world in which the story takes place, as well as the way that world interacts with the characters, must be written with a solid, comprehensible, objectively moral foundation. It's a little hard to explain, so let's look at another example. Yes, I know. This is my very first ever mention of an anime on this channel, but there's no getting around the fact that the very best animes? Do we know the plural for anime? Are miles and miles better in terms of writing than even the highest of the highbrow modern Western cinema.
Yeah, because Japan, Korea, China, the writers there haven't forgotten about making complex stories, layered characters, the hero's journey. They haven't forgotten about that. Even when they want to do something to flip it on its head, they still do it in a very compelling way. Like look at like Full Metal Alchemist. It's like so many complex characters, morally you don't sympathize with a guy who merged his daughter with that dog. To this day is still considered the saddest thing in anime history, and you hate that guy. You don't sympathize. If it was made by Western people today, they will try to do everything they can to make sure considering he's a man, I'm pretty sure they won't change much, because people certain feminists do everything they can to make you hate the guy, in any way, shape, or form. So bad example, but you know what I'm getting at, where it's like you'll try to sympathize in some shape or form with this villain, he he was like a single father, and it's like he was at his wit's end, or his daughter was sick and he's trying to do everything to keep her alive. It's like no, stop it. It's just certain Western writers do not understand how to write compelling characters and just understand morality as a whole. There are still some, but they tend to be overshadowed by the people who don't understand, because they're the ones who keep getting work, because studios are too afraid to seem like they're bigoted in some kind of fashion. Hopefully that will change when Scary Movie comes out. Hopefully there'll be a turning point where people are not afraid to push boundaries anymore, and not listen to those small, minute groups that are too obsessed with their feelings or self-identities to understand story.
I've not yet finished Attack on Titan, but something that struck me while I was working my way through the first few mind-blowing arcs was that the writer, both of the anime and the manga, had an exceptionally solid and nuanced grasp of basic human morality. The first time Eren transformed into the Titan, as people started to grasp the unthinkable thing that had happened, his friends immediately came to his defense. However, his friends weren't just blindly loyal to him, although I think some of them still might have been. Rather, they were making an informed choice in choosing to defend Eren. This was evident in their tense conversation. The writers understood that Eren couldn't be judged morally based solely on how his actions had made people feel. So when they were writing in the first major assessment of his character based on this new development, this hard moral truth was central. His friends had watched his Titan's behavior and perceived that it seemed to be trying to help them, and so understood that to some degree Eren was controlling it, and so should not be considered a dangerous threat. The rest of the world, understandably, was terrified at the thought of having a person in their midst who could theoretically transform into an unstoppable human-devouring super monster in a literal instant. The immediate reaction was to kill him. This was not a moral judgment, but a matter of safety. Over time, as various high-ranking individuals became central to this significant issue, the question became whether or not Eren could control the Titan completely. If he could, he was valuable. If he couldn't, he was dangerous. That was the only question that was important. At no point was Eren's morality taken into consideration. I mean, not in any relevant way. Many recognized that this was a good kid and a brave soldier who was a little hot-headed, but that wasn't relevant. In the hands of a lesser writer, the question of Eren's ability to control his Titan would have been painted morally. He evoked fear in his fellow humans, which was a bad feeling, therefore there must be something about him that's immoral, right? But his friends were defending him, which means he's, sensitive. That means he's actually a little moral, right? Maybe he's, an anti-hero? Or no, an anti-villain? And so on and so on. This muddy, wishy-washy absurdity would have destroyed the intricate complexities of this incredible story, and it would have completely cut the legs out from under Eren's development. He himself understood the situation. He didn't want to hurt people, but in his Titan form, he might. He himself questioned whether or not he ought to be allowed to live. This question was then reframed as perhaps a symptom of cowardice, and so on, cycling through endless examinations of morality, ethics, and character development, all because this character and this world were written with moral absolutes divorced from emotion. And thus the story, being grounded in a very solid moral foundation, was able to pack a much more satisfying and powerful emotional punch. All three of these examples are not comprehensible to the audience or to the writers as heroes, plain and simple, unless you can understand the morality at play. Analyzing complex morality is incredibly rewarding. It's also impossible if the only way you can understand morality is with feelings. Moreover, these days, the emotions of people in general, and writers in particular, have become more and more oversensitive. These sensitive emotions are then used to dictate morality in the construction of heroes. It's not at all surprising that most characters these days are just amoral blobs, despite the fact that they're very often not meant to be. Most writers will tell you that they have a right or an obligation to put their own moral opinions into their works, and that's, true. The problem is that most writers these days, besides being wildly oversensitive, are forming their moral opinions based solely on emotions. However, on top of emotions, you also have the unfortunate reality that a lot of writers like to inject current year's social issues into their hero's character, making him or her little more than a megaphone for what really amounts to little more than a rundown of the highlights of their Twitter feed. This is
And a good example of that, in my opinion, is like Kamala Khan Miss Marvel, where she could have been such a great, in some ways she's a good character in my opinion, but is like a vastly different from how she started for where she is in recent years, where she just is just a glorified mouthpiece for whatever political talking points that the writer wanted to get off her chest. So it's just like, you're not challenging Kamala Khan in any kind of meaningful way that makes her long-lasting and on the same level as something like Spider-Man or Daredevil. Because you can, if like, I made this comparison before. Treat Kamala Khan the same way you would have, like, somewhat treat like Daredevil. Daredevil often gets challenged by his faith, the way he treats like women he ends up sleeping with, the law, how he does, his hero work. Those four things are often challenged, in terms of like, not necessarily like weakness, but it's just something that like a hurdle have to get over. But he's such a compelling character over the fact that he's often challenged by his faith, given the fact that believing people can change what's right and wrong because his sense of right and wrong is based in his faith. You can do the exact same thing with Kamala Khan, but they won't do it, or at least there'll be a very scarce amount of writers who are willing to do it without worrying about the fact that, oh, you might be bigoted in some kind of way by challenging kind of Pakistani belief systems. Perfectly are right to challenge Christian views, but if it's anything other than Christianity being the punching bag, that is deemed offensive. You can't, you could do a lot with that, with Kamala Khan, but they won't do that because it's better to just have her as a mouthpiece for whatever political agenda that's going on current day, like she says, via Twitter. And only the character will suffer because of it. Miles Morales, to a certain extent, is suffering from it here and there, not all the time. Any of these young Avengers, Vision, I think, Vision's daughter robot is another one. Riri Williams, Ironheart is another one. They're not like their own character. All it is black, or it's gotta do something with their race, or they gotta do something with whatever political agenda that's going on current day. They gotta be that instead of just first and foremost superheroes, dealing with superhero stuff. Not saying you can't deal with real world situations, like most characters have done it, but it's not the bulk of their story. Like Superman's son, like most of this stuff, I don't say most of it, but a good fair amount of his stuff is, when he started going on his own, he's got to, join political rallies for like the LGBT community, and it's like it's supposed to be a superhero story, but you're just using this kid as your little political talking points. It's lame, and you handcuffing the character in a particular time frame instead of making it timeless.
Closely related to characters who are self-inserts. The danger of putting yourself into your hero is that you will be less inclined to give that hero flaws, and therefore a development arc, and you will be extremely sensitive to criticism. Emotionally, you and that character are one, making any critique of the built character a critique of your personal self. This prevents growth as a writer, and makes for characters that are difficult for anyone to enjoy or relate to other than yourself. There's also no getting around the politics of it all. And this is more of a problem with large corporate media than with those of you writing your own stories in your free time. An interesting piece of information that might be good to remember when you watch your next movie or Netflix show, it isn't just the ideology of the writers that informs the morality of the characters and the universe in which the story takes place. These writers also have to be obedient to corporate overlords, and so will bend the morality of their stories, characters, and universes to fit whatever the overlords say. As in the case of the animated Dungeons & Dragons kids show from the 1980s. Developer Mark Evanier recounted on his blog how so-called parents groups tended to dictate the content of a lot of children's television. These parents groups, he explains, are rarely comprised of parents and have zero parental interest in what they're doing. That is to say, they don't care about kids, but agendas and ideologies. As he said, consultants were brought in, and we, the folks who were writing cartoons, were ordered to include certain pro-social morals in our shows. At the time, the dominant pro-social moral was as follows: the group is always right, the complainer is always wrong. As such, this entity forced Evanier to include the much-hated character Eric as the anti-social and therefore anti-moral character. When the rest of the gang would decide to do something, Eric had to pipe up with, "Hang on, I don't think that's a good idea," whereupon he would be crushed like the little annoying pathetic coward that the show's moral landscape insisted that he was, explicitly presenting a morality in which the thing that made Eric bad was that he disagreed with the group. Thus, on-screen morality in this case was shaped and formed not by reason and logic, and not even by emotions, but in order to put forward a specific moral agenda that the makers, the so-called parent groups in this case, wanted to project out into the world, which in this case was, any thinking contrary to the group is immoral, selfish, cowardly, and reprehensible. Eric was depicted as annoying and hated in order to fit this moral image. Which is all a very fancy way of saying that corporate media companies and their controlling forces often use the stories they tell to attempt to shape and form the morality of their audience. That's not new information. And I think it's pretty clear to anyone that that type of thing is widespread these days. Just, pick your ideology. Speaking of forced illogical morality, another popular one you see all the time and almost exclusively in post-World War II is this idea that breaking the law is immoral. Now, pump the brakes, everyone. I'm not saying you have to go out and break the law to be moral. Far from it. Let's all be law-abiding citizens, okay? What I am saying, however, is that there's this weird idea nowadays that the law is morality, that we can only determine whether or not something is morally right by finding out whether or not it's illegal. How many times have you heard as someone's response to being called out for doing something wrong, well, it's not like it's illegal, or something like that? That's a really weird notion and not natural at all. The law is meant really to keep order to some degree. We humans are expected to govern our morality ourselves. That's a lot of responsibility though, so most people hand that over to the law and use legality to determine morality. Well, as long as we're not breaking any laws. Well, blowing my entire paycheck on lottery tickets isn't illegal, so... Well, cheating on my wife isn't illegal, so... Well, sleeping with a 14-year-old in Italy isn't illegal, so... Because of this, tons and tons of completely non-ambiguously heroic characters are now considered anti-heroes merely because they either routinely break the law or they operate outside the law. So you have a character like Frank Castle, who is absolutely a plain and simple black and white hero, and yet he's considered an anti-hero because he actually kills the bad guys. I don't know about you, but I have a really hard time finding the gray area in the morality of a guy who went out of his way to kill a man who offered to sell him a 12-year-old girl. In fact, it's my contention that we as audience members are more drawn to characters like Frank Castle because the morality is so cut and dry. Bad guy does objectively bad thing, good guy comes and blows him away, rinse and repeat. That's actually very satisfying, especially in a world overrun with nothing but mushy, emotional, so-called moral ambiguity. It's also not remotely anti-heroic, which makes you wonder why he's labeled an anti-hero, despite the fact that he's a very conventional hero. A true conventional hero is someone like Odysseus, who stole his enemies' weapons before he attacked so they couldn't fight back while he massacred them. Because otherwise he might not have won the fight and then his family would have been in danger. Or Brian Mills, who casually maimed and tortured his way across Paris to find his kidnapped daughter. It's not someone who wrings his hands trying to decide whether to kill or to imprison. How the hell many times did Joker break out of Arkham? At a certain point, that becomes villainous ineptitude, not conventional heroism. And audiences are instinctively aware of that. That's the biggest reason people are drawn to anti-heroes who simply aren't anti-heroes, because that's the true face of conventional heroism, guys like Brian Mills and Frank Castle. Guys like Brian Mills and Frank Castle are real heroes in the tradition of Beowulf and Odysseus and even King Arthur, and we as a society miss that. In the past, such a bizarre conflation of laws and morals didn't exist, so you could have stories of brutal, ruthless heroes who were deemed 100% heroic within the environment of the story and clearly also by the author, because the author understood that laws evolve and change and are subject to corruption, but morality is straightforward, objective truth. But nowadays, you get a guy who's a vigilante but who literally can't even bring himself to kill child traffickers, and he's somehow an anti-hero. I'm sorry, I just don't buy it. Or a vigilante who actually works with the police. What exactly makes Batman an anti-hero? Besides some random formula someone cobbled together because judging his morality was too hard or too scary. In the same way that people hand over the responsibility for determining morality to lawmakers, writers tend to hand over responsibility for determining the morality of their heroes to arbitrary formulas. What's the bottom line here? I've already said it 100 times on this channel, so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, you shouldn't use formulas or archetypes to construct your characters. But what you do need to do is understand morality, as divorced from emotion as humanly possible. Rampant emotional sensitivity in literature has been the trend for I don't even know how long, and the overall quality of literature in general and heroic characters in particular have been very slowly declining as a result. Aside from the fact that emotion is just a terrible foundation for a story or a character, I would say that emotion is just a highbrow way of saying writing for vibes. It also slowly erodes the solid moral and logical framework of humanity and of social interaction. Look at the difference between those early arcs of Attack on Titan and, say, Captain America Civil War. That entire movie was built layer upon layer on these absurd faux moral complexities that were made up entirely of emotion, which is basically like saying they were made of cotton candy. Compare the opening situation with Wanda Maximoff attempting to get rid of the bomb only for it to detonate against the side of the building, killing people, to Eren turning into a Titan for the first time. The latter was arguably more dangerous, more unpredictable, more uncontrollable, but the morality of Eren's situation was handled with simple objective truth, which in turn created a far more complex situation. However, in Wanda's case, her actions caused unintentional harm, which caused people to be scared and sad and mad, therefore she herself must be immoral. It was also an incredibly poor attempt at painting an ethical dilemma into the story, given that all the ethics, just like the morals, were based on emotion. This was the basis for the in-movie assessment of everything, how her actions made people feel. The Avengers upset people, so they were bad. Eren's actions also scared the hell out of everyone, but never was it suggested that this made him immoral. Dangerous, sure, maybe even too dangerous to be allowed to live. But what made it a lot more interesting was the clear objective moral acceptance of the fact that he was a good person. Because that moral reality was made abundantly clear, those arcs' major question, whether or not Eren could be allowed to live, cut really deep, which is more morally complex and interesting. How a superhero's accidental mishandling of a situation made people feel, or having to decide whether or not to kill an innocent kid in order to save an entire city. For the Avengers, the question of whether or not they were morally good good or bad was lost in the mire of emotion. The emphasis of the narrative was on how they made people feel, so the impactful emotions were drowned in accidental moral confusion. That's the key. If you can establish objective moral certainty, then you can play around with moral ambiguity. I can't talk about Marvel anymore, and I think I've covered this topic fairly well. I find this subject interesting, the way the eroding sense of morality in stories has in turn eroded the quality of the heroes themselves. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well if you want to leave a note in the comments. I'd love to keep talking heroes. And I do intend to do another video on villains and maybe also anti-heroes in the not too distant future if that's of any interest.
Alright. Yeah. Really love her take. And she's right. Yeah, it's like, you know, certain writers nowadays lost the plot, so to speak, in terms of writing objectively moral characters. It's more so feeling space and then actually using your head, because more often than not, if you end up using this, you know, you have a timeless character. Not saying you can't have some kind of level of emotion that can be drawn from, but that shouldn't be like the forefront of it all. But anyway, I will see you guys for the next one. Like I said, definitely follow Hillary in the second second story. I will check out the villain video some point next week. But anyway, I'll see you guys for the next one. Take care. Peace.